Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us. Today we're really getting into the ongoing investigation of the Air India Flight 171 crash. It's captured everyone's attention, hasn't it? A lot of questions. Our mission today is to try and go past the headlines, unpack some factors that maybe haven't gotten enough attention but could be really crucial. We've got some new video, recovered data, even some science concepts that might surprise you, stuff that can help us understand what happened. Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, exactly. And while the official investigation is obviously doing its work, what we want to do here is explore some specific clues, some scientific ideas that might offer real insight. It's really about encouraging that critical thinking, looking at these complex aviation events from all angles, not just the surface level stuff.
And there are definitely new angles emerging, just breaking, really, is this previously unreleased video. It shows one of the survivors emerging quite calmly, actually, from the courtyard where the plane came down. Now, we've seen other footage of him walking away, but this new clip, it sort of fills in the timeline a bit more. You see him alone, making his way out, even trying to call his dad on his phone. It's just, incredible to see someone walk away from something like that. And investigators, they haven't just found new video, right? They also got the cockpit voice recorder.
That's right. They recovered the CVR from the tail section, which is really significant news. There's obviously a lot of hope now that in the next few weeks we might get audio or maybe transcripts, something to tell us what was going on between the pilots in those final moments.
Okay, so the CVR, that sounds like the key.
It is a vital piece, absolutely a huge step forward. But it's important to keep in mind, these black boxes, they don't always have all the answers.
Okay.
Yeah, sometimes even with the CVR data, some mysteries can still remain. Some things might just stay unclear.
Okay, that's good context. Good to keep expectations in check, maybe. And speaking of other pieces, what about those issues reported before the crash? On that same plane, earlier that day, there was that passenger video, right? Someone mentioned the air conditioning wasn't working and said most of the electronics were down, like TV screens, even the call buttons for the crew.
Yeah, I saw that report.
It just makes you wonder, could that have played a role? I mean, it's definitely something investigators are going to be digging into, I'd imagine.
Oh, absolutely. They'll look at the maintenance logs, everything related to the aircraft's condition that day. Every little thing matters.
Okay, so moving away from the immediate aftermath for a second, there's this idea floating around about the takeoff itself. The runway use. Some people looking at Flight Radar 24, the tracking data.
The ADS-B data.
Right. They've suggested the plane only used like half the runway because it shows it pulling out from the international terminal. What's your take on that? Is that data reliable on the ground?
Yeah, that's almost certainly a misinterpretation. That ADS-B data, automatic dependent surveillance broadcast, it's great in the air, but on the ground, especially during taxiing, it's not always super precise. It's far, far more likely, almost standard procedure really, that the plane taxied all the way to the end of the runway, did a 180, and then started its takeoff wheel from there. Especially given the conditions that day, needing maximum performance, you can be pretty confident Flight 171 used the full length.
Right, that makes more sense. You wouldn't shortchange yourself on runway if you didn't have to. Okay, so beyond that, let's get to the core of what we wanted to explore today, this factor that maybe hasn't been discussed enough in other analyses, but could be absolutely critical. Here's where it gets really interesting. We need to talk about density altitude.
Yes, density altitude, it's a concept that's fundamental in aviation, but maybe not widely understood outside of it. Basically, it's how the airplane perceives the altitude, which can be very different from the actual airport elevation off the ground.
How the plane perceives it.
Yeah, it's mostly about temperature. Temperature is the big driver. Hot air is thin air. So, on a hot day, the plane feels like it's flying at a much higher altitude than it really is, and that puts it at a disadvantage right from the start. It's handicapped.
Handicap. How?
Think of it like doing a negative rep at the gym, when you're lowering a weight and someone pushes down on it.
Yeah, it makes it way harder.
Exactly. You have to work much harder just to control it, let alone lift it again. The plane's engines and wings are experiencing something similar. When the temperature goes up, the air molecules spread out. Basic physics, right? Heat makes things expand.
Right.
So there's literally less air, fewer molecules for the jet engines to suck in and push out for thrust. And less dense air over the wings means less lift. The plane needs way more power, more speed, more runway just to generate the same lift it would on a cool day.
Wow, okay. That negative rep analogy really makes sense. So, hot day, thin air. It's like the plane is trying to lift weights with less oxygen. And this wasn't always understood, right? You mentioned this has a history.
Absolutely. Back in the 1930s, pilots knew something was up. They'd fly into a hot airport or a high elevation one and suddenly find they needed way more runway or they couldn't climb as fast. Sometimes they even had to take weight off the plane.
But they didn't know exactly why.
Not precisely, no. The physics wasn't fully codified for practical use yet. It was more empirical observation. Weird things happen when it's hot.
Okay.
Then came World War II. You had military planes operating in really demanding environments. Think the Pacific Theater, hot, humid, sometimes high airfields.
Right. Performance would be critical there.
Totally. So that really pushed the need to develop better formulas, better ways to predict how an aircraft would perform under different atmospheric conditions. And then, by the 1950s, you see aviation authorities like the FAA adopting standard atmosphere models and, crucially, density altitude tables and calculators. Tools pilots could use to figure this out before takeoff.
So pilots today have tools to account for this.
Oh yes, it's a standard part of pre-flight planning. But understanding the impact is key. Higher density altitude means you need a longer takeoff run. Simple as that.
More runway.
More runway. It also means lower climb rates once you are airborne. The plane just doesn't ascend as quickly.
Okay.
And critically, it shrinks your stall margins. The margin between your flying speed and the speed at which the wings start producing enough lift, that gets smaller. Less room for error.
That sounds potentially dangerous, especially the stall margin part.
It can be, particularly for smaller aircraft. A smaller plane might struggle to clear obstacles like trees at the end of the runway on a really high density altitude day. In fact, pilots of small planes, general aviation pilots, they might look at the conditions, calculate the density altitude, and just decide, nope, not flying today, it's too risky.
Wow. Okay, so let's apply this directly to Flight 171. We need the numbers for that day at Ahmedabad Airport. The field elevation, you said that's the actual height of the runway.
189 feet above sea level. Pretty low, actually.
Okay, 189 feet. And the pressure?
The surface pressure reported was 29.5 inches of mercury, which is a bit lower than standard pressure, but not dramatically so.
And the temperature. This seems like a good one.
It really was. The outside air temperature was 41 degrees Celsius.
Which is what in Fahrenheit?
That's a roasty, toasty 105 degrees Fahrenheit.
105 degrees, okay.
Yeah.
So low elevation, slightly low pressure, but very high temperature.
Exactly.
So how do you calculate the density altitude from that? There's a formula.
There is. It's basically density altitude equals pressure altitude, which you get from the altimeter setting, plus an adjustment factor based on how much the actual temperature deviates from the standard temperature for that altitude. The formula is often simplified as pressure altitude plus 120, outdoor air temp in C, standard temp in C.
Okay, don't need the exact math maybe, but what's the result? When you plug in 189 feet elevation, 29.5 inches pressure, and that scorching 41 Celsius, what density altitude did Flight 171 feel like it was taking off from?
The calculated density altitude comes out to, well, it's pretty staggering. It's around 3,900 feet.
3,900 feet.
Yep, a whopping 3,900 feet.
So let me get this straight. The plane is sitting on a runway that's only 189 feet above sea level.
Correct.
But because of that heat, mainly, the air was so thin that the engines and wings were performing as if they were already up at nearly 4,000 feet.
That's exactly it. It was effectively perceiving itself to be starting its takeoff run at 3,900 feet. That demands significantly more power, significantly more runway, just to get airborne safely compared to a standard day. It puts a huge strain on performance.
That seems incredibly significant, like a massive hidden handicap.
It really is, and this is where we can start connecting the dots, maybe. Thinking about that Swiss cheese model of accident causation.
Explain that, the Swiss cheese.
Sure. Imagine you have multiple layers of safety defenses, like slices of Swiss cheese. Each slice has holes representing potential weaknesses or failures. Usually the holes don't line up. An issue in one layer is caught by the next. But sometimes, under just the right or wrong conditions, the holes in all the slices align perfectly. And that allows an accident trajectory to go right through all the defenses.
So multiple things have to go wrong and line up.
Exactly. So let's speculate here. What if, as many people suspect, the engines on Flight 171 were already having some kind of issue? Maybe not performing at 100%.
Okay, potential engine issue. It's one slice, one hole.
Right, and then you add this massive density altitude handicap. That's another big hole. Remember the effects? Less lift available from the wings.
Hole 2.
Less power produced by the engines because of the thin air.
Hole 3.
And those shrunken stall margins we talked about, less room for error.
Hole 4.
You see how quickly this can stack up. If you have slightly underperforming engines combined with this huge environmental penalty from the density altitude, those holes start lining up. It could create a situation that's very difficult, maybe impossible to recover from.
A recipe for disaster, like you said. Wow.
It's a potential scenario that investigators will absolutely be considering alongside everything else.
Okay, so we have potential engine issues, compounded drastically by density altitude. What else could be in that stack of Swiss cheese? There's always the human factor too, right? Modern planes are super automated, but pilots still have to input data, don't they?
They do, critical data. Before takeoff, pilots manually enter information into the flight management computer, or FMC. Things like the aircraft's weight, crucial for performance calculations, the outside air temperature, the runway elevation, runway conditions like wet or dry, wind speed, and direction.
So the computer relies on accurate inputs from the pilots.
Absolutely. The automation calculates things like takeoff speeds, V-speeds, based entirely on the data it's given.
Okay, so here's a thought, and this is hypothetical, obviously. But what if there was a simple data entry error, like a fat finger mistake? Say the plane weighed 500,000 pounds, but a pilot accidentally typed in only 50,000 pounds. Just misses 0. Could that happen?
It could happen. It's happened before, and the consequences would be devastating.
How so?
If the computer thinks the plane is vastly lighter than it actually is, say 50,000 pounds instead of 500,000, it will calculate performance based on that incorrect, much lower weight. Crucially, it would calculate the V1 and rotate the speeds to make the takeoff decision and lift the nose as being much, much lower than they should be for the actual weight.
So the pilots would lift the nose too early.
Exactly. They'd follow the incorrect speed cue, pull back on the controls expecting the plane to lift off, but because it's actually much heavier, it hasn't generated enough speed, enough lift to fly safely yet. The nose comes up, but the plane might struggle to get airborne, or it might lift off in a dangerously nose-high attitude close to a stall, or even run off the end of the runway.
Has that scenario, that specific error, ever actually happened?
Yes. There's a well-known precedent, Emirates Flight 407 out of Melbourne back in 2009.
What happened there?
The investigation found that the pilots had incorrectly entered the takeoff weight. They were short by 100,000 kilograms, actually, so a huge difference. As a result, the calculated takeoff speeds were too low. The plane used the entire runway, struck some antennas and lights beyond the end of the runway. It barely got airborne.
Did it crash?
Miraculously, no. They managed to climb away, realized something was seriously wrong, dumped fuel, and returned to Melbourne. But it was incredibly close. A tail strike and hitting obstacles after the runway end.
That's chilling.
Yeah.
So a simple typo, essentially, could lead to that.
It underscores how critical that human-machine interface is, even with sophisticated automation. Garbage in, garbage out applies just as much to flight computers.
So while it might seem unlikely with all the checks and balances, this kind of data entry error is still on the table as something investigators will have to rule out for Flight 171. They'll check the FMC data, the load sheets, everything.
Absolutely. They will meticulously reconstruct every action the pilots took, cross-referencing it with the data recorders.
So putting it all together, looking back at the footage, the eyewitness accounts, the observation that the plane seemed to struggle for power, and maybe kicking up dust beyond the runway's end, that suggests it really did use every inch, maybe more.
It certainly points towards a performance issue, doesn't it? Whether that's engines, environment, data entry, or most likely some combination. Investigators, as we said, they'll look at everything. The aircraft's mechanics, the environmental factors like we've discussed, the pilot's actions, their training, even their recent schedules, their diet, you name it. It's an incredibly thorough process.
Okay, so what does this all mean for understanding the Air India 171 crash? This deep dive seems to point away from one single cause. It really highlights how something like density altitude, maybe not obvious to everyone, could have been a massive factor, especially if combined with other issues, maybe engine trouble, maybe that human element of data entry. It's that Swiss cheese idea again.
Precisely. It wasn't likely just one thing. It was probably a chain, a confluence of factors. Understanding density altitude helps us see one potentially huge link in that chain. It really makes you appreciate the incredible precision needed in aviation, doesn't it?
It really does.
And how seemingly small details or this combination of factors can just have these monumental consequences. And it raises a really important question for the future, too. As automation gets more and more advanced, how do we best manage that critical point where humans interact with machines? How do we ensure data is accurate, decisions are sound, especially under pressure?
That's a big question. Balancing the tech with the human oversight. Definitely something to think about long after this investigation concludes. Well, thank you for walking us through all that. It sheds a lot of light on factors maybe we weren't considering. And thank you, the listener, for joining us on this deep dive. We appreciate your curiosity about these complex and frankly fascinating topics. We'll see you on the next one.